Okay, World War II. We're now going to move on. I'm on page 733. For those of you, at least one of you, following along in a book, so that's fine. Path to War. Essentially, once Hitler had built up Germany fully armed, he then began to set his eyes on the neighbors in an attempt to ultimately conquer the world. He made a treaty of friendship with Mussolini, and he signed a treaty with the Soviet Union called the Non-Aggression Pact, in which he promised Stalin that he would never invade the Soviet Union. Stalin promised him that Stalin would never go to war with Germany. Now, except for the treaty Hitler made with Mussolini, every treaty Hitler made was not worth the paper it was written on, including this one. But anyway, he signed a non-aggression pact with Stalin. And with Mussolini backing him up, he first set his sights on his childhood home in Austria. And he moved in on Austria, and Austria gave up without a fight. Now, I always digress right here. How many of you have seen either the play or the movie called The Sound of Music? Based on an actual true, so three of you, well, based on an actual true story about an Austrian nobleman whose family escaped to Switzerland at this time, rather than be taken over and bullied by the Nazis. He and his family escaped into Switzerland, and from there they flew to Canada, and their descendants, the last account I had, are still living in Canada to this day. Again, based on a true story of when Hitler took over Austria. When Hitler annexed Austria and forced the Austrian military to fight on the side of the Nazis, the rest of the world sat back and did nothing. The League of Nations issued a letter of protest and did nothing. Now, in the meantime, about the same time, Italy invaded Ethiopia, and took Ethiopia. Now, Italy had invaded Ethiopia in the 1890s, and Ethiopia had won. Well, in 1936, Mussolini invaded Ethiopia again, and this time Italy had planes and tanks that Ethiopia didn't have, and Italy conquered Ethiopia. Ethiopia was a member of the League of Nations. They appealed to the League. The League wrote a polite letter of protest to Mussolini and did nothing else. You know, in those days, nations didn't even pass economic sanctions against offending countries. Then, in the meantime, Japan stole Manchuria from China. China appealed to the League of Nations. Will you please help me? Japan is overrunning me. The League wrote a polite letter to Japan and did nothing else. Now today we do a little bit more. I mean, just, all right, folks, within the last month, this month, Russia has annexed the Crimea, as I think hopefully all of you are aware if you keep up with any kind of news at all. And at least the rest of the world came in and imposed economic sanctions on Russia that they hope will bring Russia's economy down. It might not. I mean, it's difficult to bring the economy down of an already economically impoverished nation. Nevertheless, at least they're doing a little bit more than the nations of the world did at this time. What was wrong with the world? The world didn't want another war. And they thought, well, give these bad people what they want, and after a while they'll quit. No, they won't quit. They always are wanting more. So Hitler had taken over Austria. Italy had annexed Ethiopia. Japan conquered Manchuria. For those of you who know your Chinese geography, Manchuria is a large portion in the northeast corner of China. And again, the League of Nations did absolutely nothing. The rest of the world, the United States, did nothing, just let them go. Yeah, they've invaded Ethiopia is on page 733. When Mussolini invaded Ethiopia, Hitler supported him, and the two men became fast buddies. Mussolini referred to it as the treaty as the Rome-Berlin Axis. I'm not going to write that down, but essentially that's why these powers became known as the Axis powers. You know, the word axis comes from the word axe, so if you know anything about wheels, the axle is the center part of the wheel. So it's we axis are in the center part of Europe, and we're surrounded on each side by enemies, but we're the center and we're going to take over all the sides of us. Axis powers. Next. Well, by the end of 1936, the Treaty of Versailles was virtually scrapped. Germany was now a world power, and all the provisions of the Treaty of Versailles said that Germany should not make more than so many airplanes, have more than so many tanks, and more than so many ships and submarines. All that was completely done away with. Germany had built up its military and was now a world power. They called it the diplomatic revolution of Europe. You know, it was a revolution that up to this point had not involved firing a shot. They said, we've changed the world. Germany is now once again at the top of the world, the top world power. They really weren't, but they thought so. And, all right, we're moving on. Czechoslovakia was next in Hitler's sights. Hitler stated that in Czechoslovakia they were oppressing his fellow Germans, the same excuse he used for Austria. So he went in and took Czechoslovakia in 3 chunks. Took the eastern part, the part nearest Germany first, then went in a few months later and took the rest of it, and then finally took it all until he had all of Czechoslovakia. So Hitler first took Austria, then he took the Czechs. At this point, the nations of Europe began to state, hey, how much more is this man going to take? So the British elected a very intelligent prime minister named Neville Chamberlain. And folk, I really want you to remember this name. He goes down in history. He goes down in history as one of the biggest fools who ever governed a major country. But actually, he was a highly intelligent man. And I've often thought that he did what I myself might have done had I been in his shoes. He made a personal telephone call to Adolf Hitler and said, Mr. Hitler, I'd like to meet you in person and speak to you. Hitler agreed, but he made Chamberlain come all the way to him. He didn't move. I mean, he didn't move to anywhere to where the trip could have been made shorter. So Chamberlain had to come all the way to meet Hitler, not even in Berlin, but in another town. And the French president, the British prime minister, Mussolini, the Italian dictator, and Hitler all met. And Hitler made a promise. He said, I have enough territory now. I promise I will not take any more territory in Europe. I'll be content with what I have. And signed a treaty that he was not going to engage in warfare. Neville Chamberlain got off an airplane. And folk, I have a video of it that I could show, but it would take me some minutes to find. But a video of him getting off the plane with a big smile, waving this treaty that wasn't worth the paper it was written on. And he told the people of Britain, no, with this treaty, folk, I have guaranteed there'll be peace in our time. I spoke with Mr. Hitler this morning. I can assure you that he and I are both committed to keeping our two peoples out of another conflict like we had a generation ago. Everything was hunky-dory, everything was all right. And folk, just 2 days after Hitler signed the treaty, Hitler next invaded Poland. Now, in effect, I mean, you know, the British and French were playing this kind of game where they were saying, they were backing up, shaking their fist. I promise, I'll go to war if you do that again. If you do, I'll go to war. Well, I'll tell you, I'm not going to back up anymore. I'm going to go to war one day. They didn't. Then Hitler got the impression they weren't going. Well, when Hitler invaded Poland, Britain and France finally declared war. The year was 1939, and World War II had begun. Now don't get mixed up, World War II began for the United States with the attack on Pearl Harbor 2.5 years later. But the war began in Europe in 1939, 2.5 years before it began in the United States. It began when Hitler invaded Poland. Britain and France went to war. And again, if you know your geography, here's Germany, and here's Poland. And over here's Poland, and of course over here's Britain, and over here's France. The British and French did not send any troops at all to help the Polish people. Instead, they let the Polish people do their own fighting while Britain and France prepared for a war on Germany's Western Front. I got to be careful how I say this, folks. I don't know much about the ancestry of any one of you, but 30 and 40 years ago, a lot of people would make jokes about the Polish. Now, in no way, I'm not going to repeat a Polak joke. I don't advocate that. The Polish people I have known have been some of the smartest people I've ever met. Individually, but collectively, they have done some things that have been utterly idiotic. The Polish people at this time met the Germans with mounted cavalry, or horsemen, men on horseback. And the Germans just mopped them up. First, the Germans used their Luftwaffe. In other words, the Air Force. The Luftwaffe went in. The whole program was called Blitzkrieg, or lightning warfare. Blitzkrieg, you know, it's lightning warfare, where you take a country like lightning. Blitzkrieg. Move in, and the Blitzkrieg consisted of, first of all, the Luftwaffe moved in, then the Panzers moved in. That was the tanks. Sorry, this was the air, this was the tanks. And then finally, the Wehrmacht moved in. Or the war machine, they were the infantry. So they would start with an air raid, and the Polish people just had to give up land at the rate of 40 miles a day, Wehrmacht. Now, talking about brilliant people doing things that are idiotic. Now, folks, I sat and watched this one time. Somebody bought into Lockheed's engineers a flashlight that didn't work. Well, these engineers got out a voltmeter, and at first said, well, let's test the battery. But that's not so bad. They tested and said, well, if there's voltage at the battery. Okay, the battery must be good. Then they tested the circuitry. Well, is voltage getting to the on-off switch? Well, yeah, they decided that voltage was getting to the switch. Well, then they turned the switch on. Now, is voltage getting past the switch? Okay, it's good. Then is voltage getting to the light socket? So they decided finally, out, we're getting voltage to the light socket. Then they took the bulb out and measured the resistance across the bulb, and they said, this bulb is burned out. Now, folks, anyone with half a brain would have probably just taken the bulb out and substituted the bulb in the first place. But what I'm getting at is these engineers were too smart to do the job they were called on. I mean, okay, if you can follow what they were doing, they were trying to trace the whole circuitry out, which is what you might do on a big machine, but on an ordinary flashlight, hey, either check the battery or check the bulb, and that's going to fix it 99% of the time. And if that can't fix it, throw the thing away. Not worth fixing. But anyway, the Polish people, like I say, were mopped up. And then the Germans just went through and did as they pleased. It seemed like all of Europe was theirs. They next invaded Norway. The King of Norway fled to Great Britain for refuge. They invaded Denmark. The Denmark people surrendered with hardly a fight. And all these were the great glorious days for the German Wehrmacht, the war machine. Everything they tried to do, they succeeded. And in short order, they conquered Europe. Then the war died down. Hitler had not planned on England and Britain and France during the war, so Hitler had to redraw up his plans. Now, if you know anything about the personal habits of Adolf Hitler, he spent a lot of his time thinking and planning. Late in the war, he was thinking and planning with armies he no longer had, with generals who were now dead, and he was going crazy somewhat. But at the beginning of the war, he was planning the war with generals he actually had, with armies he actually had. But anyway, with France and Britain in the war, he had to make some new plans. And he did what had they tried to do in World War I. He said, we'll go through Belgium to get to France. Now, folks, between wars, France had put up a line called the Maginot Line. If you think that word looks or sounds like a lot like imaginary, that's about what it proved to be. The Maginot Line protected supposedly France from Germany. In other words, it was a French line of defense that would keep the Germans out. Well, what Germany did, they went through Belgium here, just like they'd done in World War I, and they found this area completely undefended. Now, folk, from that day till this, the French people all blamed each other. Which one of them was so stupid as to leave the Belgian border undefended? Well, in World War I, the King of Belgium had fought the Germans for 4 years. But come World War II, the new King of Belgium, the son of the other king, fought for 1 hour and surrendered. And left France then wide open and undefended for the Germans to come right in. And after a few shots were fired, the French were completely overrun, and bang, France was out of the war. And this was the first time that Germany had actually brought to its knees a really, really big European country. You know, like I say, the French to this day, I mean, what happened to France is partly what's sometimes a failure of democracy. If there had been a king ruling, no king would likely have left this part of the border wide open. But this is democracy. In democracy, you discuss it, well, we want to have funds for this pro. We want to have, and let's just put money here. And if we need to, we can put the border, the line of defense up here later. But, and they haggle and bicker and argue over it. And finally, what happens is they put a line here and think they've done something and leave this part of the border wide open. Anyway, and just when it was obvious that France was not going to win the war, Italy, which had been sitting on the sidelines this whole time, they had promised Hitler that they'd help them, but they had given Hitler no help at all against Poland, and no help at all against Scandinavia. And then when Hitler invaded France, Mussolini sat there and gave no help at all until it was obvious that France couldn't win. Then Mussolini took in and struck the southern French border, or border between France and Italy. And what little was left of the French army clobbered Mussolini. Franklin Roosevelt, sitting across the Atlantic, said the hand that held the dagger tried to stick it in the back of its neighbor. Basically, Mussolini, the hand that held the dagger. But anyway, France, though, still had to surrender because they had been pretty well mopped up by Hitler by that time. And for the rest of the war, France was destined to play a very little role. Now, Great Britain had an army in France, and this army was trapped at a place called Dunkirk. And the Germans almost, the Germans were within hours of winning the war. If the Germans had come in and captured all the British troops at Dunkirk, it is likely the Brits would never have recovered, the war would have been over. Instead, Hitler told his generals, hey, stop your advance, come back, I want to talk to you. I think this is a trap, this was too easy. He stopped his generals from going into Dunkirk. Then the British came with every boat they could find, including runabouts, every boat they could get in the water. They put in the water and went and rescued their troops at Dunkirk until all the troops were rescued, 300,000. Now the equipment was up behind, the equipment was old and obsolete anyway. And besides that, the United States was about to give Britain a whole lot more equipment. Yes?
Was there actually any fighting at Dunkirk?
There was no fighting I know of. It's just that the British were there, trapped, and then Hitler told his generals to stop.
I was just reading about one of my favorite war heroes is called Mad Jack Churchill.
Oh yeah.
It says he fought at Dunkirk. That's what I was asking.
Oh, okay. Maybe there was a fight there.
He fought.
Not
struck,
much of one. I've never heard of a fight.
He struck the first blow with a longbow, and he killed a German officer with a longbow.
Okay, that might have been most of the fighting that was done then. I've not heard of anything like that, any fighting that went on in Dunkirk. The Dunkirk went because it was a rescue operation, primarily. But they saved their men. That was what was important. The British saved their men. And Hitler did not take advantage of his chance to end the war right there. Now, the United States at the time, a bunch of people told President Roosevelt, we're not going to lose our young men in this war like we did in the last war. We're not going to fight. And they got through Congress a whole bunch of neutrality legislation that simply tied the president's hands. President Roosevelt was a distant cousin to Churchill. By the way, the British replaced Chamberlain with Churchill when the war broke out. And Roosevelt was a distant cousin, and it's known that Roosevelt wanted to help. Believe me, I'm going to have a lot to say about that later, but keep in mind, you're President Roosevelt, you want to help the English-speaking British, but your own people have told you no. What do? Well, we'll find out later what Roosevelt might have done. We're not sure what he did, but what he might have done is kind of scary, to say the least. All right, this